Fact 12. The show was almost delayed out of existence. All right, we're starting at number 12, and we're starting here because this one sets the stage for everything else. The Jeffersons premiered on January 18th, 1975 on CBS. And if you're a fan of the show, you probably know it was a spin-off of All in the Family, the groundbreaking show that introduced George Jefferson as the loud, opinionated, always in Archie Bunker's business neighbor from next door on 704 Hauser Street in Queens. But here is what most people don't know. Norman Lear, the brilliant producer behind All in the Family, had already planned and committed to Sherman Hemsley playing George Jefferson, significantly earlier than 1975. The character was supposed to appear on All in the Family in 1973, 2 full years before the Jeffersons ever premiered. The reason it didn't happen? Sherman Hemsley was on Broadway. Specifically, he was in the cast of a musical called Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope, and he had a contractual commitment to that production that he simply could not walk away from. Norman Lear, to his enormous and lasting credit, did not just recast the role. He waited. He held the role of George Jefferson specifically for Sherman Hemsley, wrote around the character's absence on All in the Family for 2 full seasons, and essentially kept the entire Jeffersons idea parked and waiting for this one specific actor to become available. Now, think about that for just a moment. Because we live in an era where actors get recast if they sneeze at the wrong time. Studios do not wait for anybody. Time is money, and casting directors have audition lists a mile long. But Norman Lear looked at Sherman Hemsley and said, "No, it's him. We're waiting. Write something else in the meantime." And the reason that decision matters so much is that when Sherman Hemsley finally did get on screen as George Jefferson, both on All in the Family and then in The Jeffersons, he brought something to that character that genuinely could not have been replicated by anyone else. The walk, the delivery, the specific brand of loud, strutting, brilliant, infuriating, completely lovable arrogance that made George Jefferson one of the most iconic human beings in television history. Nobody else on earth could have done what Sherman Hemsley did with that role. If Norman Lear had gotten impatient, if he had said, "Forget it, let's find someone else," we might be having a very different conversation right now. Or no conversation at all. So the next time you hear that theme song and feel that immediate rush of comfort and nostalgia, understand that part of what you're feeling is the result of one producer refusing to settle and one actor honoring a prior commitment even when a bigger opportunity came knocking. Integrity built this show. We are just getting started. Fact 11. The theme song was written and sung by someone you know from a completely different show. Fact 11. Movin' On Up is not just a great TV theme song. It is one of the great American theme songs, period. Full stop, no argument accepted. There is not a person alive who has ever watched The Jeffersons who cannot immediately sing at least the first 2 lines the moment they hear the opening notes. It is locked in. It is permanent. It might genuinely be the most purely joyful 30 seconds in the entire history of television music. But here is the thing most fans have never fully registered. The person who wrote that song and the person singing it on the recording is someone you almost certainly know from somewhere else entirely. That voice, that soaring, electric, triumphant voice telling you that they're moving on up to the east side to a deluxe apartment in the sky? That is Jeanette Dubois. And if that name rings a bell, it absolutely should, because Jeanette Dubois was simultaneously playing Willona Woods on Good Times on CBS. At the exact same time The Jeffersons was airing on CBS. Let that fully land. The woman singing the theme song for The Jeffersons was, at the same time, one of the main cast members of Good Times.
She was doing both. She co-wrote Movin' On Up alongside songwriter Jeff Barry, recorded it with all the power and glory you have been hearing your entire life, and that recording became the signature sound of a completely separate show while she was actively starring in another one. Now, for those who might need a quick refresher, Good Times was also a Norman Lear production, running from 1974 to 1979, also on CBS, following a black family living and fighting and surviving in the housing projects of Chicago. It was in many ways a thematic counterpoint to the Jeffersons. Good Times was about people struggling to stay afloat. The Jeffersons was about people who made it all the way to the top. The voice connecting both worlds, the voice of survival and the voice of triumph, was the same voice, Jeanette Dubois. There is something genuinely poetic in that when you sit with it. The same woman who was laughing and crying and fighting for her family in the projects on Good Times was the woman on the other channel telling George and Louise Jefferson that the sky was the limit and everything they worked for was finally theirs. Jeanette Dubois passed away in February of 2020, and when she left, she took with her one of the most genuinely remarkable creative voices in the history of Black American television. But that recording of Movin' On Up, that specific, irreplaceable, goosebump-inducing recording, is going to outlive all of us. And now, you know the full story of who made it and what they were doing at the same time. Fact 10. The age gap between the two leads was enormous, and nobody talked about it. Fact number 10, and this one has been sitting in plain sight for 50 years, and people still barely address it. So let me put it on the table clearly and let you sit with it. George and Louise Jefferson, Sherman Hemsley and Isabel Sanford, were one of the most convincing married couples in the history of American sitcoms. Their chemistry was completely real. Their bickering was completely real. The specific way they pushed each other's buttons, drove each other absolutely mad, and still so obviously loved each other with every fiber? Real. You watched them interact and you believed it without question. Here is the fact most fans have never looked up. Isabel Sanford, the woman who played Louise Wheezy Jefferson, was 21 years older than Sherman Hemsley. 21 years. Sherman Hemsley was born on February 1st, 1938. Isabel Sanford was born on August 29th, 1917. She was born during the First World War. Let that actually land for a moment. She was born during World War I, and she played one of the most vibrant, funny, sharp, warm, and deeply beloved characters in American sitcom history. Still commanding scenes, still getting the big laughs, still absolutely carrying the show's emotional weight well into her 60s. When The Jeffersons premiered in 1975, Isabel Sanford was 57 years old. Sherman Hemsley was 36. The couple that America watched fall in love all over again each week, argue their way through every problem, build a business together, and climb their way to the East Side, were 2 decades apart in real life. And you would never have guessed it for even 1 second. Not one. That is the extraordinary thing. You watch those episodes and the age gap simply does not exist on screen. Isabel Sanford commanded every single scene she was in with such authority, such energy, such natural ease and presence that the concept of anyone being too old for anything feels genuinely offensive when applied to her. In 2004, Isabel Sanford passed away at the age of 86. At the time of her death, she was the recipient of a Primetime Emmy Award, and when she won that Emmy in 1981, she became the first Black woman in history to win the award for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Comedy Series. She was 63 years old when she stood on that stage and accepted that award. 63! She peaked at 63. There's hope for all of us. Fact 9. Florence the maid was discovered while working at the airport. Fact number 9. And this one is the kind of story that sounds like something a Hollywood screenwriter invented, because real life simply is not supposed to work this cleanly. Marla Gibbs, Florence Johnston, the maid who absolutely did not behave like a maid. The woman who walked into the Jefferson penthouse every single day, said exactly what she thought without being asked, insulted George Jefferson directly to his face on a near constant basis, and somehow kept her job for 11 full years. Florence became one of the most beloved supporting characters in the entire history of American television, and Marla Gibbs played her with such specific, precise, and completely effortless brilliance that it's easy to assume she was some kind of seasoned Hollywood veteran with decades of experience when she first walked onto that set. She was not. She was a reservations clerk at United Airlines. That is the whole sentence. Marla Gibbs was processing flight bookings, talking to customers about layovers and connecting flights and baggage allowances when she decided to go ahead and audition for the Jeffersons. She was not a household name. She had not been working her way up through a long list of smaller television roles. She was booking seats on airplanes and answering phone calls about ticket prices. She auditioned. She got the part, and then, because she was practical, because she had real sense, because this whole television thing was brand new and she was not going to bet everything on it immediately, she kept her job at United Airlines for a period of time, just in case. Think about what that means. There is a stretch of time in American television history where Marla Gibbs was filming episodes of The Jeffersons and then going back to United Airlines to make sure she had something solid to return to if the whole thing fell apart. The woman who would go on to become Florence, one of the most quotable, most imitated, most dearly beloved characters in the golden age of sitcoms, was hedging her bets with an airline job while she was literally on television. And you know what? You cannot be mad at that. You genuinely cannot be mad at a person for having good sense. She was being responsible. She was doing what any reasonable person does when they're not completely sure the dream is going to hold. The dream held. It held for 11 seasons, a primetime Emmy nomination, a legacy that is still very much alive, and a spin-off we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. Marla Gibbs was born in 1931 and is, as of this recording, still very much with us, still sharp, still working, still every bit the force she has always been. The next time Florence walks into that apartment uninvited and says something nobody asked her to say, just know that a United Airlines reservations desk is somewhere in the origin story of that exact moment. Fact 8. The Jeffersons put an interracial couple on primetime TV when that was still genuinely radical. Fact number 8. This one requires a little bit of context because context is everything here, and I don't want the weight of it to get lost. Tom and Helen Willis, played by Franklin Cover and Roxy Roker, were the Jeffersons' neighbors, and over time, they're genuine friends. They were charming, warm, funny, and a totally natural part of the show's world. If you grew up watching the Jeffersons, you probably didn't think twice about Tom and Helen. They were just Tom and Helen, the couple from down the hall, part of the furniture. But in 1975, when The Jeffersons premiered, an interracial couple appearing as regular, recurring characters in an American primetime sitcom was not normal. It was not common. It was not yet something that television had fully accepted. It was, in the truest sense of the word, radical. Tom Willis was white. Helen Willis was black, and they were presented not as a special topic, not as a very special episode statement, not as a storyline the show was using to teach the audience a lesson. They were presented simply as people, as a married couple who happened to live nearby, as two human beings navigating the exact same world as everybody else in the building, as a completely ordinary feature of the world the show is presenting. That might sound unremarkable from where we're sitting today, But in 1975, there were network executives, advertisers, and a significant portion of the audience who were genuinely uncomfortable with that image on their television screens every week. Interracial marriage had only been legally protected across all 50 states in America since 1967, just 8 years before The Jeffersons premiered. 8 years. That is not ancient history. That is a blink. And Norman Lear put Tom and Helen Willis on the screen anyway, made them regulars, made them funny and real and human, made them the kind of couple you rooted for. And in doing that, The Jeffersons was quietly and consistently, week after week, placing an image in front of America that a significant part of America was not yet comfortable with, and daring America to enjoy it anyway. Most people did, and in enjoying it, they were changed, just a little, whether they realized it or not. That is how good television actually works. We are going to come back to Roxy Roker and Helen Willis in just a few minutes, because there is a detail about her life off-screen that has its own complete and extraordinary story. Fact 7. Lionel Jefferson was played by 2 completely different actors, and the show barely blanked. Fact number 7, and this one still gets to me a little bit, because it's the kind of thing that once you know about it, you cannot unsee it when you go back and rewatch. Lionel Jefferson, George and Wheezy's son, appeared as a character across both All in the Family and The Jeffersons, and across those 2 shows, he was played by 2 completely different actors. Not one actor who looked vaguely similar, 2 different men with different energy, different delivery, different screen presence, and a different face. The original Lionel was played by Mike Evans, and Mike Evans was genuinely excellent in the role. He brought a particular warmth and grounded intelligence to the character, a young man who was clearly doing the work of building his own identity while navigating life with George Jefferson on one side and the racial and generational politics of Archie Bunker's world on the other. Mike Evans built what Lionel was. He established the character's foundations. Then, in 1975, when The Jeffersons moved to its own show, Mike Evans departed the role. Not because the show let him go. He left. He left to pursue other opportunities, including a transition into writing, and the production replaced him with an actor named Damon Evans. Chuckleatly. No family relation whatsoever. Just 2 men who happened to share a last name. And now we're sharing a character. Damon Evans played Lionel for a stretch of seasons. Then Damon Evans departed. And then, in a development that still makes viewers do a double take, Mike Evans came back. The original Lionel returned just like that. The show essentially trusted that its audience was loyal enough and engaged enough to simply accept the situation and keep moving. And largely, they did, because that is the specific kind of loyalty the Jeffersons had built across its run. Now, recasting was not unheard of in television in that era. It happened on other shows. It still happens today. But what makes this particular situation striking is that Lionel was not a background character or a minor figure you might forget between episodes. The Jeffersons was a central character, the son of the 2 main leads. He was central to the family's emotional story. He was in storylines about marriage, about identity, about what it truly meant to carry the Jefferson name. And the show swapped out the actor playing him, eventually brought back the original, and continued, flatly, without making a large event of either change. The audience stayed, the ratings held, the show went on. Happily, both Damon Evans and Mike Evans deserve genuine recognition for carrying that role through complicated circumstances and for serving the story as best they could with what they were given. Fact number 6. And this one is part triumph, part heartbreak, and part comedy, which honestly is deeply on brand for Florence Johnston. By the early 1980s, Florence had become so popular, so embedded in the cultural consciousness, so beloved by the show's audience that CBS made the call. She was ready for her own show. A full spin-off, a vehicle built specifically around Marla Gibbs and the character that America had fallen completely and totally in love with. The show was called Checking In. It premiered in April of 1981. In the show's storyline, Florence had left the Jefferson household temporarily, as the narrative framed it, and was now working at a luxury hotel in New York City. The concept made sense on paper. Florence was sharp. Florence was hilarious. Florence could carry a room by herself without even warming up. If any supporting character from any show in that entire era deserved a shot at their own platform, their own space to shine, it was Florence Johnston. Marla Gibbs had proven over and over again that she had the ability, the presence, and the range to lead. The show lasted 4 episodes. 4 episodes. Checking In was canceled in April 1981, the exact same month it premiered. CBS pulled the plug almost immediately, citing low ratings. The entire run was so brief that a significant portion of the viewing audience did not even know the show existed before it was already gone. Forever. And here is the part that is equal parts awkward and genuinely fascinating. During the period that Checking In was airing, Marla Gibbs had taken a hiatus from the Jeffersons to do the spin-off, which means that for those 4 episodes, the Jeffersons was running on CBS without Florence in the building. And then Checking In got canceled, and then Florence just came back. Back to the penthouse, back to insulting George to his face daily, back like it had been a long weekend. The show essentially had to absorb Florence back into the household and continue moving, treating the entire Checking In situation as a minor detour, rather than the dramatic career pivot it was supposed to be. Which, when you stop to think about it, is exactly the kind of thing that would happen to Florence, and is exactly how Florence would handle it, by walking back through that door with her head high, saying something cutting to George before he could get a word in, and acting as though she had never left. Marla Gibbs was not damaged by this, not for 1 second. She came back, she kept delivering, and Florence remained as beloved as she had always been. But Checking In stands as one of the more instructive cautionary tales in sitcom history, about the difference between a character who works brilliantly inside a specific world and a character who can carry a completely new world entirely. Florence needed George Jefferson. Florence needed that penthouse. Florence needed the friction and the family and the specific chaos of that apartment building. As it turns out, so did we. Fact 5. Helen Willis was Lenny Kravitz's mother in real life. Fact number 5. I need you to be fully present for this one, because this is the connection I mentioned earlier in the hook, and it is genuinely one of those facts that realigns your entire understanding of multiple things at once. Roxy Roker, the actress who played Helen Willis, one half of the interracial Willis couple, Tom and Helen, the marriage that helped make The Jeffersons one of the most quietly progressive shows on American television throughout its entire run. Roxy Roker was the real-life mother of Lenny Kravitz. Yes, that Lenny Kravitz. Are You Going to Go My Way, Lenny Kravitz? Grammy Award-winning rock and roll meets soul and funk, one of the defining musical voices of the 1990s and beyond, still iconic decades later, Lenny Kravitz, the man whose name alone carries a whole energy. His mother was Helen Willis. Here's the full picture. Roxy Roker, who is black, was married in real life to a man named Cy Kravitz, a television news producer who was white. So the interracial relationship that Roxy Roker was portraying on screen as Helen Willis week after week, year after year on The Jeffersons, that was not a creative stretch for her. That was her actual lived reality. She understood those dynamics from the inside. She knew exactly what it meant to be in an interracial marriage in America in that particular era because she was in one every day when she went home. And the child born from that real-life interracial marriage went on to become one of the most decorated and celebrated musicians of his generation. Lenny Kravitz won 4 consecutive Grammy Awards for Best Male Rock Vocal Performance, a record that still stands today. He has sold over 40 million albums worldwide. He has acted in major films. He has worked as a designer and architect. He is, by any reasonable measure, a cultural titan. And his mother spent 11 years playing Helen Willis on The Jeffersons. Roxy Roker passed away in December 1995. She was 66 years old. And Lenny Kravitz, across various interviews over the years, has spoken about his mother with the kind of love and depth that tells you everything you need to know about who she was as a person and as a parent. The groundedness she gave him, the artistic spirit, the sense of who he was in the world, and where he came from. So the next time you're watching The Jeffersons and Helen Willis walks into a scene and says something kind and steady, know that the woman on your screen raised Lenny Kravitz. She lived the truth of what she was portraying. She put it on screen with grace, and she sent a legend into the world. Some family trees are just built different. Fact 4. Sherman Hemsley was the complete opposite of George Jefferson off camera. Fact number 4. And I love this one specifically because it completely rewires the way you see the performance every single time you watch the show from this point forward. George Jefferson, the character, the walk that has been imitated more times than anyone could count, the mouth that never stopped, the absolute ironclad, world record-setting confidence that bordered on arrogance, the man who walked into every room as though the room had been sitting there, waiting for him to arrive, who argued with everyone about everything and never once looked like he felt bad about it, who had opinions so loud they practically needed their own zip code. George Jefferson was bold, brash, forward, and completely unapologetic about every single thing he thought, said, and believed. By every account from people who knew and worked alongside Sherman Hemsley, the man who played George Jefferson for 11 years, Sherman Hemsley himself was almost none of those things in real life. Not one of them. He was quiet. He was gentle. He was introverted. He was private to a degree that genuinely surprised people who encountered him off-set. He did not command rooms the moment he walked in. He did not strut. He did not announce himself. He was a man who kept largely to himself, who thought carefully before speaking, who was deeply thoughtful and soft-spoken, and who preferred peace and quiet to the kind of constant, high-volume confrontation that George Jefferson had built into a permanent lifestyle and an art form. Think about what that requires as a performer. Think about what it actually takes, technically, emotionally, physically, to spend 11 years showing up and building a character whose entire personality, whose entire way of moving through the world is the complete and total opposite of your own. To find that specific energy every single day, to put on that swagger, that walk, that voice, that fearlessness, and make it look not just convincing, but effortless for over 250 episodes. The walk alone, that famous, unmistakable George Jefferson strut, was something Sherman Hemsley developed deliberately and consciously. It did not come naturally to him. He built it. He constructed it as a physical vocabulary that belonged entirely to the character, and then he inhabited it so completely and so consistently that it became one of the most recognizable physical signatures in the history of American television. Let that sink in. Sherman Hemsley passed away in July 2012. He was 74 years old. And in the tributes that came in from those who had known him, the portrait that emerged was strikingly consistent. A gentle, private, deeply kind man who gave the world one of its loudest, most electric, most larger-than-life television characters. A quiet soul who built a legend. That gap, the distance between who you are in private and who you become on screen, is what separates genuinely great actors from merely good ones. George Jefferson was Sherman Hemsley's gift to you, to all of us. Treat it accordingly. Fact number 3, and this one matters because it is easy, genuinely easy, to think of The Jeffersons purely as a comedy, as a fun, warm, breezy, hilarious show about a family that finally made it. And it was absolutely all of those things. But it was something more than that, too. And that something more deserves to be named directly and clearly. The Jeffersons regularly went to places that primetime American television was not going in the 1970s and 1980s. And it went there without making a production of the fact that it was doing something unusual. It just went, without announcement, without fanfare, with complete confidence. Gun violence. The show addressed it. In one memorable and genuinely sobering storyline, Tom Willis is shot. Not in a cartoonish way, not in a way that gets tied up neatly by the end of the episode. The show sat with the real weight of what gun violence actually does to a family. The fear, the aftermath, the way it changes the people closest to the person who gets hurt. Suicide. The show addressed it. George's friend Harry Bentley, played by Paul Benedict, was involved in a storyline dealing with suicidal ideation that was handled with a level of genuine care and seriousness that was uncommon for the era. Racism. And not just in broad strokes. The show was honest enough to let George Jefferson himself carry prejudice. George's frequent, pointed hostility toward Tom Willis, simply for being white, was a consistent thread across the entire series. The Jeffersons did not just present racism as something that happened to Black characters from the outside. It was willing to show that racism lives in complicated places, including inside people who have every reason in the world to understand its damage. That kind of nuance, that honesty, was rare. Alcoholism, class anxiety, the very particular psychological weight of having grown up with absolutely nothing and suddenly having everything and living with the constant low-grade terror of losing it. The Jeffersons put all of that on screen, and they did it inside a comedy. They did it in the same show where Florence was insulting George every 6 minutes and Tom Willis was walking into the wrong apartment for the 100th time. They held both things simultaneously, the genuinely funny and the genuinely serious. And they made it feel completely natural because life itself holds both things at once. Real life does not separate its comedy from its weight. Norman Lear understood something fundamental about how people actually receive difficult truths. You can slide them in through laughter. You can make someone feel something real and lasting if you give them something to laugh about first, lower the guard, then tell the truth. The Jeffersons was proof every single week that he was absolutely right. Fact 2. The show ran for 11 seasons and made history in the process. Fact number 2. And this one is worth saying at a measured pace, so it lands with the weight it actually deserves. The Jeffersons ran for 11 seasons, 253 episodes, from January 1975 to July 1985. 11 consecutive years on CBS. 11 years of George and Wheezy and Florence and the Willises and Bentley and every other character that became part of the extended family America built around this show. At the time of its cancellation in 1985, The Jeffersons held the distinction of being the longest-running American sitcom with a predominantly Black cast in television history. 11 seasons. Seriously, that record was not a small footnote. It was a landmark. It was the kind of sustained achievement that cements a show's place, not just in pop culture memory, but in the actual documented history of American media and representation. The kind of record that gets carved into what this industry is. Think about what 11 seasons means in concrete human terms. A child born in 1975, the year The Jeffersons first aired, would have been 11 years old when it ended. Their entire conscious memory of what television was would have included The Jeffersons as a permanent, reliable, there-every-week fixture. It was not a show you liked. For millions of Americans, it was part of the furniture, part of the week, part of what home felt like. The show was consistently ranked in the top 10 in the Nielsen ratings, the system used to measure how many people were actually watching, year after year, season after season. It was not a cult favorite. It was not a critically beloved underdog that found its audience slowly. It was a hit. A consistent, sustained, decade-long hit that America returned to faithfully every single week. And behind those numbers was a cast of predominantly Black actors getting to portray characters who were not defined by poverty, not defined by struggle, not defined by their relationship to whiteness or their proximity to white characters. George Jefferson was successful, aggressively, loudly, unapologetically, strutting down the hall, successful. And he was the center of his own show in 1975 on primetime American network television. Seriously, that meant something enormous. It still means something enormous. The Jeffersons' 11-season run was not luck. It was the result of great writing, a remarkable cast with genuine chemistry, a producer who understood which stories were worth the risk of telling, and an audience that showed up every week for over a decade. 253 episodes, 11 seasons, one legacy. Fact 1. The show was canceled with zero warning, and the cast found out through the press. Fact number 1. The biggest one, the one I have been holding on to since the hook because it deserves to be the last thing you hear, because it is the fact that still makes something tighten in my chest when I think about it carefully. And I think you are going to feel the same way. The Jeffersons ended in 1985. There was no series finale. Let me say that again so it is completely clear. There was no series finale. There was no special goodbye episode. There was no final scene where George and Wheezy stood in that penthouse apartment and looked at each other and reflected on everything they had built and everywhere they had come from. There was no moment for Florence to deliver one last perfectly aimed insult before she walked out the door for the final time. There was no closing shot of the East Side skyline. No final, triumphant reprise of moving on up. No ceremony, no acknowledgement, no send-off. Just nothing. And then it was over. CBS canceled The Jeffersons in 1985 without notifying the cast or crew in advance. The people who had given 11 years of their professional lives to the show, who had shown up season after season, episode after episode, and built something that millions of Americans tuned into every week, found out their show was done the exact same way everyone else did. They read it in the press. Sherman Hemsley, Isabel Sanford, Marla Gibbs, the entire cast and production crew. They found out The Jeffersons was canceled by reading about it in the newspaper or hearing it reported in the media. There was no meeting with network executives. There was no phone call before the announcement went public. There was no dignified, private, human communication extended to the people who had built this show from nothing and turned it into one of the longest-running and most-watched sitcoms in American television history. The people who were the Jeffersons found out the Jeffersons was ending the exact same way a stranger sitting in Ohio found out, through a headline. And because there was no warning, there was no opportunity to film a proper finale, no chance to write a meaningful final episode, no chance to give these characters, George, Wheezy, Florence, the Willises, Bentley, a real send-off that honored what they had been to the audience for 11 years. The last episode of The Jeffersons aired on July 2nd, 1985. It was a regular episode, a normal, standalone story written with the assumption that the show was going to continue into another season, that it would be back in the fall, that there would be more time. There was not more time. And that episode, written as a middle chapter, aired as a final one, is the last thing audiences ever got. 11 seasons, 253 episodes, one of the greatest theme songs ever recorded, some of the best comedy ever put on American television, and some of the quietly powerful, honest moments the sitcom format has ever produced. And it ended with a headline in a newspaper that the cast read alongside everyone else. That is fact number 1, and it is the one I want you to carry with you.